Jack had been on the road for days. The desert stretched endlessly in front of him, with only the sound of his horse's hooves on the dry, cracked ground breaking the silence. He didn't mind the loneliness. It was what he had become used to. For years he'd traveled alone. No family, no friends, no one to call his own. It had started after the loss of his wife, Emily. The grief had been too much, and the quiet solitude of the open plains had offered him a way to escape the memories. Every now and then, he would come across a small town, a place to rest his tired bones and get some food. But Jack never stayed long. People were kind enough, but he was always the outsider, the loner with a haunted look in his eyes. He wasn't looking for company. He didn't want any attachments. So he kept riding, hoping to outrun the ghosts of his past. On this particular evening, as the sun began to sink low in the sky, Jack found himself on the edge of a small, abandoned ranch. He wasn't sure why he had stopped. There was nothing here that seemed interesting or worth his time. Just a few dilapidated buildings, the remains of a barn, and a rickety wooden fence that had been blown down by countless storms. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with a sense of stillness, almost unnatural. His horse, Rusty, snorted uneasily as he slowed to a stop. Jack noticed the uneasy behavior but didn't pay it much attention. Horses could be skittish sometimes. Still, there was something about this place, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He dismounted, tying Rusty to the nearest post and deciding to take a look around. The first thing he noticed were the signs of a struggle. The dirt by the entrance was disturbed, footprints leading inside the rundown farmhouse. Jack had seen enough to know that this wasn't just the result of a passing storm or wild animals. There had been people here, and something had gone terribly wrong. His boots crunched on the dry earth as he approached the door, pushing it open slowly. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. It didn't seem like anyone had lived here for years. The furniture, if you could call it that, was broken and covered in layers of grime. There was a sense of decay in the air, a place abandoned, forgotten by time. Jack stepped further inside, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze landed on the corner where 6 bodies lay sprawled across the floor. His heart skipped a beat. At first he thought they might just be old, abandoned mannequins or some cruel joke, but the twisted, unnatural positions of their bodies told him otherwise. They were real. He moved closer, his boots tapping softly against the wooden floor. As he neared, the awful truth became undeniable. These were people, men and women, all of them lifeless, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. There were no signs of struggle beyond their final moments. It was as though they had simply dropped dead. A cold chill ran through Jack's spine. He knelt down beside one of the bodies, his breath shallow. There was something deeply unsettling about this scene. He had seen death before many times, but never like this. There was no sign of injury, no blood, just a sudden and inexplicable stillness. He rose to his feet, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his revolver. He wasn't sure what had happened here, but he knew he needed answers. As his eyes swept the room once more, they landed on a small figure huddled in the shadows, almost as if she were waiting for him. Jack tensed. He hadn't heard anyone. Was she one of the survivors? Was she the one who had done this? He didn't know, but he couldn't just leave her there, not when the situation felt so wrong. Hello? His voice echoed in the empty room, rough from the dust in the air. Are you all right? The woman didn't respond at first, but Jack saw her eyes gleam in the dim light. Slowly she shifted, stepping out of the shadows. Her face was pale, her hair wild and tangled. She looked like someone who had been living in fear for far too long. Jack took a cautious step forward. Are you all right? He asked again, his voice softer now. The woman's lips trembled as she looked at him. They touched me, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jack could barely hear her words. And they died. Jack's eyebrows furrowed. What in the world was she talking about? Had she been here with the bodies? Was she the cause of all this death? He didn't know if he believed her, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. She seemed to be trapped in some kind of nightmare that she couldn't escape. What do you mean they died? Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He had to know more. The woman shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice breaking. Every person who touches me, they die. I don't know why. I don't know how. Jack's mind raced. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. There were no signs of violence, no weapons or clues that could explain the deaths. Yet here she was, claiming that everyone who had come into contact with her had died. Was it a curse? Or was there something darker at work here? He studied her face, trying to decide if he could trust her. She seemed sincere, her fear genuine. There was something about her that made Jack hesitate. He could see that she wasn't a killer. She was just as much a victim in this strange situation as the people lying dead in the room. But Jack had learned the hard way not to trust too easily. He had been wrong before and it had cost him. "So you're telling me that everyone who touched you died?" Jack asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The woman nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, and I've been running ever since. I thought if I stayed away from everyone they'd be safe, but I don't know how much longer I can keep running." Jack took a deep breath, trying to make sense of it all. Nothing about this made any sense. Still, he couldn't leave her alone, not when there were so many unanswered questions. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jack said, his voice softer than before. "But I need to know more. We need to figure out what's going on here." For the first time since he had found her, the woman seemed to relax a little. She wiped away the tear on her cheek and nodded. She was still frightened, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been abandoned completely. Jack stepped closer, offering her a hand. "We'll figure this out, together." And with that, the two of them, bound by fear and a shared desire for answers, prepared to face the unknown. The air inside the small abandoned house felt heavier than before, as though something was pressing down on Jack and the strange woman. Jack stood a few steps away from her, still trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Her words echoed in his mind. "They touched me and died." He could barely believe it, but the terror in her eyes told him that whatever she said, she truly believed it. There was no mistaking the fear in her voice. Jack took a deep breath. The weight of the situation pressed on him, and for a moment he almost wished he had never stopped at this ranch. But he couldn't turn back now. The woman, Clara, was in trouble. There was no doubt about that. And if there was even the slightest chance that she was telling the truth, he couldn't leave her to face whatever this was on her own. He glanced back at the 6 bodies on the floor, their lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Jack had never seen anything like this before. There had to be an explanation, but none of the usual answers seemed to fit. No signs of poison, no gunshots, no obvious wounds. Just death, sudden and strange. Clara seemed to sense his hesitation. She shifted uncomfortably where she stood, her feet barely making a sound on the dusty floor. Her clothes were torn and stained, and her hair, wild and unkempt, framed her face in a way that made her look even more vulnerable. She couldn't have been much older than 20, but the years of fear and hiding seemed to have aged her far beyond her years. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't ask for any of it." Jack took a careful step closer, still unsure of what to believe. He didn't know why, but something inside him told him that Clara wasn't a danger. She didn't seem like someone who could harm anyone, let alone kill them. And yet the evidence was right in front of him, the 6 bodies, cold and still, and the strange words she had spoken. Something was happening here, something that Jack needed to understand. He didn't want to pry, but curiosity got the better of him. "What do you mean by they touched you?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "How could a touch kill someone?" Clara swallowed hard, the fear creeping back into her eyes. She looked down at the floor as if the words she needed to say were too painful to speak aloud. For a moment Jack thought she might not answer. But then, after a long pause, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how it happens," she said, her voice shaky. "It started when I was a little girl. They started getting sick when they came near me. At first I thought it was a coincidence, you know. But then they just died." Jack felt his stomach tighten. He couldn't even imagine what that must have been like for her. A little girl watching people around her drop dead without understanding why. It was a nightmare, and Clara had been living it for years. No wonder she seemed so haunted. "I tried to stay away," she continued, her eyes filling with tears. "I ran from home when it happened to my family. I thought maybe if I just stayed away from everyone, they would be safe. But it didn't stop. Every time I touched someone, they died." Her voice broke, and she had to pause to collect herself. Jack didn't know what to say. There was nothing he could say. He could feel the weight of her words. the years of isolation and fear that had built up inside her. It was like something out of a nightmare, and yet, here they were, standing in the middle of it. He wanted to help her, but how could he? She was convinced that her touch was deadly, and every person she had come into contact with had paid the price. So, you've been running all this time? Jack asked, trying to understand her situation better. Clara nodded, wiping a tear away. I don't have anywhere to go. I can't go back to my family, they're all gone. I've wandered for years, always looking over my shoulder, afraid to get close to anyone. But now, after everything that's happened here, I don't know how much longer I can keep running. Jack could feel the weight of her words settling over him. It was one thing to hear about someone running from danger, but to actually see it, to understand the terror that came with every step they took, was something else entirely. Clara's life had been nothing but fear and loneliness. Jack had his own scars, but this was different. This was a curse, one that seemed to have no explanation and no end. Jack didn't know how to help her, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just walk away. Something about her story struck him deeply. There was no anger or malice in her voice, no sign of deceit. Just a raw, unfiltered fear. Clara wasn't responsible for what had happened to those people. She was just as much a victim as they were. I know you're scared, Jack said, trying to comfort her. But running won't solve anything. We need to figure this out. We need to understand why this is happening. You don't have to face this alone. Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge whether she could trust him. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, there was a loud creaking sound from the back of the house. Jack's hand instinctively went to the revolver at his side, his body tensing. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up again. It was the same feeling he had gotten when he first arrived at the ranch. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just the bodies in the other room. Clara seemed to sense it too. She stiffened, her body shrinking into itself. We're not alone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows. The house had been empty when he arrived, but now it felt like they were being watched. There was no sign of anyone else, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. Stay close to me, Jack said softly, his voice calm but firm. He slowly made his way to the back door, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Clara stayed close behind him, her footsteps light and hesitant. The tension in the air was thick, and every sound seemed to be amplified. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he opened the door, stepping cautiously into the fading light of the evening. There was no one there. Just the empty silence of the desert stretching out in front of him. But even though he didn't see anyone, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was waiting just beyond the edge of the night. Maybe it's just the wind, Jack muttered. Trying to calm his nerves, Clara didn't respond. She only looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Jack couldn't help but wonder what other secrets she was hiding. What else was she afraid of? They stood there for a moment in silence, the air still and heavy, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the landscape. Jack couldn't help but feel that they had just stepped into something much bigger than either of them could understand. Whatever was happening here, whatever curse Clara believed she carried, it was only the beginning. As the night deepened, the silence between Jack and Clara grew heavier. The air around them felt thick, charged with a tension neither could escape. Jack was beginning to feel the weight of their strange connection. It was undeniable that Clara needed help, but he still didn't know exactly what was happening here. Every moment felt like a puzzle that was one piece too short to complete. They had stepped out of the house trying to make sense of their surroundings. Jack had wanted to check the rest of the ranch for any clues, but the eerie feeling in his chest held him back. He knew they couldn't stay out in the open for too long. They needed to find shelter. The last thing they needed was for whatever strange force was causing all this death to catch up with them. Clara, though, didn't seem to want to move from the edge of the house. Her eyes were distant, as if lost in thought. She hadn't spoken much since the brief encounter with the back door, and Jack could tell she was deep in her own troubled mind. He didn't blame her. She had lived with fear for so long, carrying the burden of something she didn't fully understand. It must have been exhausting. We should move inside, Jack said, his voice gentle, trying to bring her back to the present. It's safer in there. Clara nodded slowly, but there was hesitation in her movement, like she was unsure of what she was afraid of now. It wasn't just the curse that haunted her. It was the life she had been forced to live because of it. Jack could see the sadness in her eyes. She wasn't just running from death, she was running from herself. But that wasn't something Jack could fix, not yet at least. He had to focus on the task at hand, finding out the truth behind these deaths and, if possible, stopping them. Once inside the house again, they sat on the dusty floor near a broken window, the moonlight casting pale shadows on the walls. Clara's arms were wrapped around her knees, her posture tight as though she were trying to protect herself from something only she could see. Jack didn't know what to say. He wasn't a man who often found comfort in words, and he wasn't sure what would make Clara feel better. But he also knew he couldn't leave her in silence. Not now. So, tell me more about what happened, Jack asked softly, trying to keep his tone calm. You said it started when you were a little girl. What exactly happened when you first noticed it? Clara sighed heavily, her eyes distant again. She took a moment as if gathering the courage to relive the memory. Jack waited patiently. He understood that whatever she had to say wasn't easy to hear. I was just a child when it started, Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't understand what was happening. It was my mother first. She came to hug me and she just fell to the ground. Like something inside her had stopped. Clara's voice broke as she remembered that horrible moment. I thought it was an accident, but then it happened again and again. Jack felt a chill run through him. He had heard of strange diseases, accidents, and even some terrible, unexplained phenomena in his time as a cowboy. But nothing like this. Nothing that could take the lives of people so easily, so quickly. I ran away. Clara continued, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to do. My father tried to stop me, but I was so scared. I thought I was killing them. I thought something inside me was broken, and that I was the reason people kept dying. She paused, wiping a tear from her eye. That's when I left. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay. Not after what happened to my family. Jack's heart went out to her. No child should have to face such a burden. The terror of losing her family, of believing that she was the cause of it, must have scarred her deeply. And then what happened? Jack asked softly. Clara wiped her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. I traveled from town to town, always moving. I couldn't stay in one place for too long. I was afraid I would hurt someone else. But it didn't matter. Every time I tried to be close to someone, they just died. I couldn't understand why, and every time it happened I felt more and more like a monster, like I was cursed. She shook her head. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be normal, to be like everyone else. Jack felt the anger building inside him, but not at Clara. No, it wasn't her fault. It was whatever force had cursed her, whatever darkness she was carrying. And whatever it was, Jack was determined to help her break free. Clara, you're not a monster, Jack said, his voice low but firm. You didn't do anything wrong. This curse, it's not your fault. But we can figure out what's causing it. We can find a way to stop it. Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and skepticism. You really think so? She asked, her voice small. How? How can we stop something like this? Jack paused, considering her question. He wasn't sure how they were going to stop this, but he knew they had to try. He had seen too many strange things in his life to just give up, and something inside him, something deep down, told him that Clara wasn't beyond help. I don't know yet, Jack said, shaking his head. But I'm not going to leave you until we figure it out. We'll work together. Clara gave a weak smile, the first one Jack had seen since they met. It was small, fragile, but it gave him a little bit of hope. He hadn't expected to be pulled into something like this. A curse. A strange force causing death wherever Clara went. It was all beyond anything he had ever known. But that didn't matter now. He had made a promise, and he wasn't the type to break it. As the night wore on, Jack and Clara talked in hushed tones, discussing everything they could think of. Clara described the strange events surrounding her life, the moments when she felt the presence of the curse, when the force seemed to grow stronger, and how every time it happened she would run, terrified of what might come next. I don't know what to do, Clara admitted, her voice full of helplessness. I've tried everything I can think of. I've stayed away from people. I've stayed in places far away from towns, but it doesn't stop. It doesn't go away. Jack sat back, his mind racing. He was beginning to piece things together, but it was still like trying to fit a puzzle together without all the pieces. What was this curse? Why was it attached to Clara? And most importantly, what could they do about it? I think we need to get to the bottom of this, Jack said after a long silence. There's got to be a reason why this is happening. We can't keep running. We need answers. Clara nodded, though there was still a hint of doubt in her eyes. But where do we start? What do we do? Jack stood up and looked toward the window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break over the horizon. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't stop until they found out what was behind the curse. We start by finding out who or what is behind this, Jack said firmly, his voice filled with determination. We'll figure this out, Clara, I promise. And as the sun began to rise, Jack and Clara knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with dangers they didn't yet understand. But one thing was certain: they would face it together. The following days felt like a blur to Jack. Every time he tried to make sense of the situation, he found himself deeper in the mystery. It wasn't just Clara's curse that he was trying to understand, but the strange pull that this place, this ranch, had on him. It seemed to be more than just the eerie deaths. It was as though something was lurking in the shadows, something that neither of them could see but both could feel. Jack and Clara didn't spend much time out in the open after that. It wasn't that they were hiding, but the unease of the place was enough to make both of them reluctant to venture too far. They stayed inside the old house, where Jack made a makeshift bed for Clara and a small resting space for himself. The house was far from comfortable, but it offered them shelter and a place to think. Over the course of the next few days, Jack and Clara tried to make sense of everything. Jack spent most of his time scanning the ranch, hoping to find some clue that would help explain what was happening. Clara, on the other hand, seemed consumed by her fear, as though she could sense something watching them. She rarely slept, her eyes darting nervously whenever the wind howled outside, carrying with it the strange whispers that seemed to follow them everywhere. One morning, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, Jack was up early. He'd spent the night thinking about their next move. The silence of the ranch was oppressive, but Jack didn't want to ignore the obvious. Clara had said that she had been running for years, never staying in one place too long. She feared the touch of others, and every person she had come into contact with had died. It didn't take long for Jack to realize that the answer wasn't just in the strange deaths. It was in Clara's very presence. Somehow, there had to be a connection between Clara and whatever was haunting this place. Jack's mind raced as he stared out over the empty land. The air felt thick with something, almost like a weight pressing down on him. It wasn't just the curse. It was the feeling of being trapped, like a hunter waiting for its prey to wander too close. The thought sent a shiver through him. Clara, Jack called softly as he turned back toward the house. I think I found something. Clara looked up from the small makeshift table where she had been sitting, her face pale and tired. She had dark circles under her eyes, evidence of the sleepless nights she had spent in fear of the curse she believed she carried. She had been avoiding Jack's gaze lately, but now her expression changed slightly. There was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. What did you find? She asked, her voice still trembling from the anxiety that seemed to grip her every moment. Jack motioned for her to follow him as he made his way outside, the sound of his boots echoing in the quiet morning. Clara hesitated for a moment, but then followed him, her feet light but hesitant, as if she were being drawn into something she couldn't escape. They walked around the side of the house and toward a small, overgrown path that led into a patch of woods behind the ranch. Jack had noticed the trail a few days earlier, but hadn't thought much of it until now. He'd decided to follow it this morning, and it led him to an area that seemed untouched by time. The trees were dense, their branches heavy with leaves, and the ground was soft, covered in moss and dried leaves. It looked like the sort of place people avoided. The kind of place where secrets were buried. Where are we going? Clara asked, her voice quiet but anxious. She had started to pick up on Jack's urgency, sensing that he had discovered something important. There's something here I need to show you, Jack replied, his voice steady, though inside he was filled with anticipation. This might be the breakthrough they needed. If there was anything at all that could explain what was happening, it had to be here. As they moved deeper into the woods, the air grew cooler. It wasn't just the temperature. It felt like the very atmosphere had changed. The birds seemed to fall silent, and the rustling of the leaves under their feet grew louder, echoing in the otherwise still environment. Clara's steps slowed as she glanced around nervously, as though the woods were closing in around them. But Jack didn't stop. He needed to find what was hidden in this place, and he couldn't afford to be afraid. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small clearing in the woods. At the center of it was an old stone structure, barely visible beneath the thick vines and overgrowth. It was a well long forgotten by time. The stones were weathered and cracked with ivy curling around the edges. The air around it felt different, charged, as if something powerful had been lying dormant for years. Jack stopped in front of the well and turned to face Clara. She was standing a few feet behind him, her eyes wide with fear. He could see her hesitation, the anxiety gripping her every muscle. She had stopped moving, and Jack could tell she was torn between fear and curiosity. "Is this—" Clara began, but she couldn't finish her sentence. She knew instinctively that this was something important, but she wasn't sure whether it was something she wanted to understand. "This is where it began," Jack said quietly, his voice low but certain. "This is the place where your curse started." Clara stared at him, her face pale. "How do you know that?" Jack took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on the well. "I don't know for sure, but I feel it. There's something about this place, something ancient. This curse didn't just happen by chance, Clara. It's connected to something here." Clara's body stiffened. No, it can't be. I've never been here before." Jack turned to face her. "Maybe not physically, but something has drawn you here. Whatever this curse is, it's tied to this land, and you're part of it. We need to understand why." Clara shook her head, her voice rising in panic. "No, I can't. I don't want to know. I've been running for so long because I'm afraid. Afraid of what's inside me. Afraid of what might happen if I find out the truth." Jack reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. We're going to face this together." For a long moment, Clara didn't speak. She just stared at the well, her body trembling with the weight of her own fears. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't control it? What if it's too much?" Jack looked her in the eyes, offering her a reassuring smile. "You've carried this burden alone for so long. Now it's time to face it, together." Clara took a deep breath and nodded, though her fear still lingered in her eyes. Jack could see that she wasn't completely convinced, but he knew that this was the first step. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. As Jack knelt down by the well, he felt a strange pull, a sense of urgency, as if something deep within the earth was calling to them. Clara stood behind him, watching silently, her heart racing. The wind rustled the leaves around them, carrying with it a low, almost inaudible hum like a distant whisper. "This is it, Clara," Jack said, more to himself than to her. "This is where we find the truth." And with that, Jack slowly reached for the well, ready to uncover the secrets it held, and with them, the answers that Clara so desperately needed. The air around the well grew heavier, the tension almost unbearable as Jack and Clara stood silently before it. The wind seemed to die down, and the only sound was the quiet rustling of leaves in the distance. Clara felt her heart pounding in her chest, her body tense as though she could feel the weight of something long buried just beneath the surface, something ancient, something dangerous. Jack's hand hovered above the stone of the well as if waiting for a sign, something to guide him, but there was no sign, no light to shine through the darkness, only the hollow, oppressive silence that seemed to consume them. Clara's eyes were fixed on the well, her body frozen in fear. She had lived with the knowledge of her curse for years, running from it, hiding from it. But now, standing here, facing it head-on, she realized just how deeply it had affected her, how it had become a part of her. "Jack," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "What if it's too much? What if we can't stop it?" Jack turned to look at her, his face calm but his eyes full of determination. "We can stop it. We have to." For the first time in a long while, Clara felt the smallest spark of hope. She had never let herself believe that she could ever be free of the curse. That maybe one day, she would be rid of the fear that had followed her for so long. But Jack's words, they made her believe, even if only for a moment, that it might be possible. Maybe she wasn't doomed. Maybe there was a way out. "Whatever this is," Jack said, his voice steady, "it's not something that can control you forever. We can break it. We just need to find out how." Clara nodded slowly, unsure but willing to try. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. If they were going to stop this curse, they had to face it head on, together. Jack took a deep breath, then placed his hand on the stone of the well. The instant his fingers made contact with it, something strange happened. The air around them seemed to shift, and for a moment, Clara felt as if the world was holding its breath. It was as if the very earth was reacting to Jack's touch. Something deep and powerful was awakening, and they were caught in the middle of it. Clara stepped back instinctively, her heart racing. She had always felt a connection to this place, but now it was more than just a feeling. It was as if the well was calling to her, pulling her in. She could feel a strange energy thrumming through her body, like electricity running through her veins. It was overwhelming, and for a brief moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of it. "Clara," Jack said, his voice breaking through her panic. "I need you to focus. We can't let it control us. We have to stay strong." Clara nodded, swallowing hard. She couldn't let the fear take over now, not when they were so close. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the well, joining Jack. They stood side by side, both feeling the weight of the moment. "This is where it began, Clara," Jack said softly. "This is the heart of it. Whatever has been controlling you, whatever has been causing this curse, it's tied to this place. We need to break it." Clara stared at the well, trying to calm her racing thoughts. "But how? How do we break it?" "I don't know what to do." Jack looked at her, his face full of conviction. "We're going to face it together. Whatever it is, it's been feeding off your fear. That's what has kept it alive for so long. You've spent years running from it, but now it's time to confront it. We need to end it once and for all." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she felt something shift inside her. The fear that had defined her life for so long was still there. But now it was different. Now she wasn't alone. Jack was standing beside her, his steady presence giving her the strength she needed. She had never had someone by her side like this. Not someone who truly understood her. Not someone who wasn't afraid to face the darkness with her. Slowly, Clara knelt beside the well, placing her hands on the cool stone. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing, trying to calm the storm of emotions that had built up inside her over the years. This was it. This was the moment when she had to let go of the fear. She had to stop running. "Whatever it is," Clara whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." As soon as the words left her lips, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. A low rumble echoed from deep within the earth, as though something ancient and powerful was awakening. Jack grabbed Clara's hand, holding it tightly. He could feel the energy surging through the ground, the power that had been lying dormant for so long now stirring. And then suddenly the well began to glow. The light wasn't bright, but it was strong, almost as though it were coming from deep within the earth itself. Clara felt the energy pull at her, but this time, instead of fear, she felt something else, a sense of release. The years of terror, of hiding, of living in fear of the curse, all of it seemed to be lifting from her, as though the well itself was finally giving her the freedom she had longed for. "Clara," Jack said, his voice urgent. "Do you feel it?" Clara nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. She could feel it now. The weight of the curse that had held her for so long was starting to break apart. The energy was shifting, becoming lighter, more peaceful. The power that had once controlled her was losing its grip. With a deep breath, Clara stood up and stepped closer to the well, her hand still firmly in Jack's. She reached out, touching the stone again. As her fingers made contact, the light from the well grew stronger, enveloping them both in its glow. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The world held its breath, and then with a final powerful surge, the light erupted from the well, flooding the clearing in a brilliant flash. Clara gasped, her heart racing as she felt the last remnants of the curse break away. When the light faded, everything was still. The air felt different now, lighter, calmer, as though a heavy burden had been lifted. Clara looked around, amazed. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her. It was gone. Jack looked at her, his eyes full of pride. "You did it," he said softly. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She hadn't just broken the curse. She had broken free. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. They stood there for a moment side by side, watching as the first light of dawn touched the earth. The darkness had passed and the world was beginning anew. Together, they had faced the unknown and come out victorious. And as the sun rose over the horizon, Clara knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She didn't have to run anymore. She didn't have to live in fear. The curse was over. and with Jack by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.